Good morning. My name is James Forrest. For the past 10 years, it has been my pleasure to teach this course on modern terrorism and counterterrorism at the Fletcher School, and I'll be doing so again for the spring 2021 semester. A summary of my professional background is available on the Canvas course website. This video is meant to provide a brief overview of what we routinely cover in this course, focusing on how we will navigate a fairly extensive field of research in the study of terrorism and counterterrorism with scholarly journals, books, reports, databases, and other literature to draw upon. I'm going to quickly scroll through a bunch of PowerPoint slides that visually reflect what's covered in the course, but feel free to pause the video if you'd like more time to review what you see on your screen. We begin in week 1 by examining the contested terrain of defining terrorism. As you may know, there are many definitions of the term and a lot of debate about what may or may not be considered terrorism. There are some common themes, however, including political agendas, violence used to intimidate and coerce, the role of communication, and the impact of psychological trauma. Then we dive into the history of terrorism, covering about 200 years of different terrorist movements and the grievances that have motivated these acts of criminal and political violence, including anarchists, left-wing terrorist groups, and religious-oriented terrorist groups. We will look at the decision-making of terrorist groups, as well as the financing of terrorism, including state sponsorship and the intersections of criminal activities like trafficking and drugs and weapons. We'll examine the goals and objectives that terrorist groups most often seek to achieve, and the strategic logics behind different approaches to the use of terrorist violence, like provoking a government to overreact to the threat of terrorism. Research in this area also reveals why terrorist groups often make tactical decisions based on risk avoidance and concerns about return on investment. For example, we know that one reason very few terrorist groups have embraced weapons of mass destruction is their overarching fear of operational failure. The more complicated a weapon or plot, the more things can go wrong, and thus a higher chance of failure. So most terrorists prefer the simplest kinds of weapons: guns, knives, cars, basic explosives, and so forth. In this portion of the course, we'll also examine the communicative aspects of terrorism, especially in terms of how terrorist groups try to inspire individuals to carry out attacks entirely on their own. Special attention will be given to the rising threat of far-right terrorism in Europe and the US, which many scholars and policymakers acknowledge is responsible for the highest numbers of attacks and deaths from terrorism these days. Unfortunately, most forecasts indicate we will see more of this type of political violence in the future. Then we will also explore the various intersections of religious extremism and political violence, the most prominent example of which is the global jihadist movement. There are many prominent contributors to the ideological core of this global jihadist movement, so we'll briefly look at how individuals like these have provided certain elements of inspiration for those who went on to join groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. The ideology of the movement reflects both religious and political elements, and over the past 3 decades, the movement has expanded into a multidimensional landscape with core groups, affiliate groups, and others inspired by this ideology. Then, just over halfway through the course, we shift gears to focus on counterterrorism strategies and frameworks, drawing on research about how to influence the behavior of violent non-state actors. There are, of course, a variety of strategies to explore in the field of research. The way I approach counterterrorism includes an understanding of the challenges that are faced by terrorist networks. The research on the history of terrorism reveals that most terrorist groups throughout the past 2 centuries have failed rather quickly. And here we begin to see why failure is so common among terrorist groups who are unable to navigate the external challenges and the internal challenges that they face. One of my favorite parts of the course involves examining the inherent vulnerabilities of terrorist networks and how these can be exploited. For example, trust among operatives is essential for a clandestine network to operate effectively. We also examine research on why individuals have left terrorist networks, because this kind of information helps us develop strategies for how to encourage others to disengage from terrorist activity. As more people disengage and membership in a terrorist network declines, the threat of violent extremism naturally diminishes, a core objective of any counterterrorism strategy. Of course, there is no universally effective formula for counterterrorism. As we discussed throughout the course, terrorism does not just emerge in a vacuum. It is a very contextual phenomenon, requiring a contextually appropriate counterterrorism strategy and response. And towards the end of the semester, we will take a look at some ways of assessing the progress of a nation's counterterrorism efforts. As you may imagine, there are both quantitative and qualitative aspects to these kinds of assessments. So that wraps up a quick overview of what we'll cover in this course. To summarize, we will explore a broad range of theories and research from social psychology, political science, communication studies, economics, religious studies, criminology, and other fields in our study of terrorist movements. The study of terrorism and counterterrorism is very interdisciplinary and requires a great deal of attention to contextual factors. I should also mention that because this course will be held virtually via Zoom, we have a unique opportunity this year to bring in some expert guest speakers from around the world to join us for our discussions. In terms of course assignments and student responsibilities, students are asked to read the assigned materials for each class meeting beforehand and come to class each week prepared to discuss and engage with those materials. A research paper and a final exam will be used to assess learning. I welcome auditors in the class, but I ask that they commit to writing a short research paper on a topic of their choosing in order to demonstrate their understanding of the course material. Now I invite you to review the complete syllabus available on the Canvas course website and to contact me with any questions you may have. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to meeting you in January.